I was sitting at my old wooden desk, crunching numbers like any other Thursday, when my phone buzzed. It was a text from Jane, my best friend since high school and practically family. "Hey, big party this Friday at Rick's place. You in? Could use a wing woman." Jane's message read. I texted back. "Sure, sounds fun. Been ages since we did something stupid." She replied instantly. "Awesome. Oh, and Tom's gonna be there. You'll finally meet the infamous BF." I rolled my eyes at that. Jane had been seeing Tom for a few months now, and she was head over heels. I hadn't met him yet, but from what Jane gushed about, he was the catch of the century. Closing my laptop, I glanced at the clock. It was nearly time to leave. I grabbed my things and headed out, deciding to swing by Grandma's on my way home. As I walked in, the smell of baking apples filled the air. Grandma was in the kitchen, pulling an apple pie out of the oven. "There's my girl," she exclaimed, her eyes twinkling. "Perfect timing. Help yourself to some pie." I hugged her, and she patted my back with her flour-dusted hand. "How you doing, honey?" "Actually going to a party tomorrow. Jane's boyfriend will be there. It's a meet and greet for me," I said, taking a bite of the warm pie. Grandma raised an eyebrow. "Boyfriend, huh? Don't let those boys mess with you or Jane." "We joked about that the other day," I laughed. "Said no man's born who could mess with our squad." "Good, keep it that way," she advised, her tone firm but loving. "Men come and go, but your bond with Jane, that's for keeps." I nodded, knowing she was right. After pie, I helped clean up and told her about the party details. She listened, nodding and ing in all the right places. The next day after work, I got ready for the party. Choosing an outfit was a battle between casual and trying too hard. I finally settled on a simple black top and jeans. It was Rick's place after all, not some fancy downtown club. I arrived a bit late, the place already buzzing with music and chatter. Jane spotted me first, waving frantically from across the room where she stood with a tall, dark-haired guy. "Emma, you made it. Come meet Tom," she shouted over the music. As I approached, Tom turned and smiled, his gaze lingering a bit too long for a casual once-over. "Heard a lot about you," he said, his voice smooth. "Only the good stuff, I hope," I replied, trying to match his casual demeanor. "All good, promise," Jane chimed in, her eyes darting between us. Something in her look made me cautious, but I brushed it off as party nerves. We chatted, the three of us, and Tom was charming, making me laugh more than I expected. But every now and then, his compliments felt a tad too pointed, his glances a little too sharp. I ignored the nagging feeling in my gut, blaming it on overthinking. After the party, things between Tom and me picked up speed faster than I ever expected. Just 3 months down the line, and there I was, standing in front of a mirror in a bridal shop, staring at my reflection in a white dress that I had picked out in a dizzying rush. My mom was with me, and she kept fussing over every little detail, making sure the veil sat just right on my head. "Emma, you look beautiful, honey. But are you sure? This all seems so fast," she said, her voice laced with worry. I forced a smile, trying to brush off the doubt that kept creeping up. "Mom, it's fine. We're fine. Tom's great, you know that." She sighed, smoothing down the fabric of my dress. "I know, I miss Jane being around." "Have you talked to her lately?" The mention of Jane was a jab to my gut. We hadn't spoken since the engagement party, a party she left early, with a tight smile and an even tighter hug goodbye. "Not really, Mom. You know how it is. Things just got a bit complicated." The weeks leading up to the wedding were a blur of planning and tension. Jane's absence was a gaping hole in every festivity. I tried reaching out to her, but my calls went to voicemail, and my texts remained unanswered. It hurt more than I cared to admit, and with each passing day, the weight of her absence grew heavier. Finally, the wedding day arrived. The walk down the aisle was a mix of smiles and well wishes, but all I could see was the empty seat where Jane should have been. Tom stood at the altar, looking dapper and smiling broadly as I approached. His eyes were bright, but behind the joy, I caught a flash of something else. Was it impatience? We exchanged our vows, and the pastor pronounced us husband and wife. The reception that followed was lively, with music and laughter filling the air, but the celebrations felt hollow without Jane laughing and dancing beside me. During the reception, I overheard a conversation that made my stomach turn. Tom was talking to some of his buddies, not noticing I had walked up behind him. "Yeah, it's all set now. She's a good girl, got her head on straight, especially with finances. We'll be sitting pretty, you'll see," Tom said, a sly grin spreading across his face. His friend clapped him on the back, laughing. "Always had a sharp eye for the good ones, eh, Tom?" I stepped back, my heart racing. Was he talking about me? About us? What did he mean by that? I wanted to confront him, to ask him outright what he meant, but I hesitated, the fear of stirring up a scene at our own wedding holding me back. I forgot about that conversation the very next day. It was domestic, comfortable even, but there were undercurrents, ripples that kept disturbing the peace I desperately wanted to believe in. My job was one of those ripples. After the wedding, walking into work every day felt like stepping onto a stage. Jane's dad, Mr. Coleman, had always been good to me, but with Jane and I no longer talking, I was nervous about where I stood. Turns out, I didn't need to worry, at least not about my job. Mr. Coleman called me into his office about a week after I got back from the honeymoon. "Emma," he started, his voice all business, "I want to be clear. Whatever's happened between you and Jane, it's got nothing to do with work. You're a good accountant, and as long as that continues, there's a place for you here." I nodded, relieved yet still tense. "Thank you, Mr. Coleman. I appreciate that, really." He waved a dismissive hand. "All right, then. Back to it." That brief conversation was a load off, but it wasn't the only weight I carried. Every couple of weeks, Tom and I would visit his mother in her home deep in the forest area, a quaint little cottage surrounded by all sorts of flora. She was a herbalist, her life dedicated to plants and potions. I respected her craft, but every visit was a test of my patience. The first time we went after getting married, her welcome was less than warm. "Oh, Tom, still with Emma, I see. I'd thought by now you'd have come to your senses," she'd said, eyeing me like I was a particularly disappointing batch of herbs. Tom had just laughed, his arm around my shoulder a little too tight. "Mom, come on. Emma's great, you know that." His mother clicked her tongue, shaking her head as she poured a viscous liquid into a jar. "If you say so. But remember, the offer stands. Jane would make a fine wife, knows her way around the kitchen and a balance sheet." The ride home that day was quiet. I stared out the window, my arms crossed, the hurt sitting heavy in my chest. "Your mom really doesn't like me, does she?" I finally said, unable to keep the bitterness out of my voice. Tom sighed, a quick glance in my direction before focusing back on the road. "She's old-fashioned, you know? Set in her ways. Just give it time." "But why doesn't it bother you? She's talking about your ex almost like I'm just warming your seat until you go back to her," I snapped, the frustration boiling over. He was silent for a long moment, then shrugged. "I don't know, Em. It's just how she is. Don't take it to heart." But how could I not? Each visit, each comment, it was like a reminder that I wasn't quite what anyone was expecting or hoping for. I was the placeholder, the not quite right choice. And with Tom's passive acceptance, I felt increasingly isolated in my own marriage. The day Grandma passed away was like someone had ripped the ground out from under me. She had been more than just family, she was my compass, especially in these stormy times. The funeral was a blur of somber faces and consoling pats on the back, all muffled under the heavy gray sky that seemed to press down just for me. After the funeral, we gathered at her lawyer's office for the reading of her will. I sat there, numb, not really expecting much. Then the lawyer announced it. Grandma had left her big house and $400,000 to me. Just me. My head spun, and from the corner of my eye, I caught Tom's reaction. His eyes didn't just light up, they practically sparked with excitement. "Wow, babe, that's amazing," Tom said, squeezing my hand a bit too tightly as we left the lawyer's office. "Your grandma really set us up." The discomfort started there, a nagging tug in my stomach. I tried telling myself it was just grief, that the unease was from losing grandma, not from how Tom was acting. But deep down, I knew better. This was a different kind of discomfort, one that I couldn't just explain away. Back at home, things started to change. Tom began disappearing in the evenings, coming home later and later with barely an excuse that made sense. He'd brush off my questions with a flick of his hand. "Just out with the boys, you know how it is." But I didn't know. It all felt off. The final straw came one evening over dinner when he brought up the money and the house. "You know, Emma," he started, his voice casual as he passed me the salt. "We should really think about investing that $400,000. And the house? We could sell it. Make a fortune and invest that too." I stared at him, my fork halfway to my mouth, the food suddenly tasteless. "Sell Grandma's house? Are you serious?" "Yeah, why not? It's just sitting there, and think about the money we could make." He was all enthusiasm, as if he'd laid out the perfect plan. I put my fork down, my appetite gone. "No, Tom. I'm going to rent it out. It's what she would have wanted, and the money's going into a fund for our future children's education." Tom's face changed then, his smile disappearing. "That's a stupid idea, Emma. We could be rich if you weren't so sentimental about that old place." His words stung, and we ended up in a heated argument, voices raised, words that couldn't be taken back thrown carelessly into the space between us. He stormed off eventually, and we didn't speak for days. The next time Tom and I spoke, it was awkward, a thin veneer of normalcy painted over our unresolved conflict. "Look, Emma, I'm sorry for blowing up," he said one evening, his voice soft, almost contrite. "I just think we need to think about our future, about making the most of what we've got." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, my words likely to betray the resentment that had started to fester. "We'll do it your way," he added, but the way he said it, like a concession rather than agreement, left me cold. As days turned into weeks, the distance between us grew. Tom spent more time out, and I spent more time at Grandma's house, planning the renovations needed to turn it into a rental property. It was one of those rare Sundays when we didn't have much planned, so Tom suggested we go visit his mom. I agreed reluctantly. Each visit was harder than the last, but I didn't want to be the reason he couldn't see his mother. She greeted us with her usual reserved smile, but it didn't take long for the atmosphere to shift. Not even halfway through dinner, she started rubbing her temples, her sighs heavier than the humid summer air. "I've been feeling so unwell lately," she moaned, casting a pointed glance my way as if my mere presence might be the cause. Tom immediately jumped to her aid, his voice filled with concern. "Mom, what's wrong? Is there anything we can do?" I knew that tone, it was the prelude to him volunteering my time like it was his to give. And sure enough, his next sentence was directed at me. "Emma, maybe you could stay here for a few days? Help Mom out?" I was already shaking my head before he finished. "Tom, you know I've got a packed schedule at work. Besides, maybe it's time to consider a more permanent solution?" "I don't trust modern medicine," she snapped, waving a dismissive hand at me. Her other hand gestured towards the shelves lined with herbs and bottles. "I have my remedies. I just need a bit of help around here, that's all." The ride home was icy. Tom's disappointment was palpable, a thick fog that filled the car and left no room for reasoned conversation. "You know, I'm not sure you really love me," he said suddenly, his voice cold and distant. "Refusing to help my mom says a lot about your feelings towards my family." I turned to him, stunned. "How can you question my love based on this?" I've supported every decision, attended every family gathering, and now you say this? You don't act like someone who's part of this family. Maybe I made a mistake marrying you. He shot back, the words slicing through the last threads of my patience. Are you saying you want a divorce? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. If things don't change, maybe I do, he replied curtly, his profile stark against the passing streetlights. The next few weeks were rough. Tom withdrew further, busying himself with anything that meant not having to spend time with me. At night, he'd talk to his mother on speakerphone, her loud, self-pitying complaints about her health echoing through our apartment. Oh, Tom, I don't know how much longer I can manage on my own, she'd wail. Your wife doesn't even care if I die. And each time, Tom would look at me with accusation in his eyes, as if her health was my responsibility. After several nights of this, I couldn't take it anymore. I started wearing earplugs, the soft foam a blessed barrier against her manipulative moans. It was a usual Thursday afternoon when I decided to check our joint savings account, a routine I had pushed aside for months due to the constant chaos at home. Logging in, I anticipated seeing our usual balance, but the numbers that greeted me sent a chill down my spine. The account was nearly drained. Stunned, I scrolled through the transaction history. Large withdrawals stamped with just ATM and no further explanation. My heart raced as I pieced together that these withdrawals coincided with the nights Tom came home late or not at all. I felt a sickening mix of betrayal and panic gnawing in my stomach. I couldn't confront Tom, not yet. I needed more information, something concrete before I sparked a confrontation that I wasn't prepared to handle. That's when the idea of hiring a private detective came to me. I found a reputable detective online and explained my situation over a hushed phone call from the back of a cafe. 3 agonizing weeks later, the detective called me back. We need to meet, was all he said. Sitting across from him in a dimly lit corner of a different coffee shop, the detective laid it all out. Your husband's in deep, he started, his eyes not leaving the file in front of him. He's racked up a significant amount of gambling debt. The kind that gets dangerous. My hands trembled. How bad? Bad enough that he's desperate. He's been talking about your finances, specifically your inheritance, as a way out. I recorded a conversation between him and his mother. It seems they have plans for your assets. He played the audio clip. Tom's voice, casual and cold, discussing how soon my money would fix everything. I felt nauseous listening to his plans, spoken so freely, as if I was nothing more than an obstacle to be dealt with. I was still reeling from this revelation when my phone buzzed. It was Jane, my long-lost friend, the one person I thought I had pushed too far away to ever return. Her text was simple, need to talk. Can you meet today? Hours later, I sat across from Jane in yet another cafe, the noise around us a stark contrast to the silence that had stretched between us for months. She looked nervous, playing with her coffee cup before she spoke. Emma, I'm here because Tom has been contacting me. He's made advances, said things. She paused, her voice shaking. He told me he made a mistake marrying you, that he should have been with me all along. I felt like I was in a nightmare, everything spinning out of control. You're telling me this now? Why? Because he asked me to do something unthinkable. He wanted me to convince my dad to fire you. Said that once you were jobless, you'd have no choice but to depend on him, to move in with his mother. She pushed her phone across the table, playing a recording of their conversation. Tom's voice, clear and manipulative, detailing his plan like he was plotting a business move. I sat there, stunned and heartbroken. Not just by Tom's betrayal, but by the enormity of his deceit and manipulation. Leaving the cafe, I felt a mix of fear and clarity. It was clear now that Tom and his mother were not just overbearing, they were dangerous. The drive over to Tom's mother's house that weekend felt longer than usual. I felt like I was heading straight into the lion's den, armed with nothing but a fragile plan and a heavy heart. When we arrived, his mother greeted us with her customary cold warmth, a thin smile that never quite reached her eyes. Almost immediately, she started her usual routine of complaints and thinly veiled barbs. "Oh, Emma, dear, I'm just so frail these days, barely can manage on my own," she lamented as we settled into the musty living room. I nodded, my stomach churning, but I had my own plans. "Why don't we start with a little walk outside? Some fresh air might do us all good." His mother hesitated, then agreed, shuffling towards the door with more agility than her complaints suggested. Once outside, I made a show of tying my shoelace and let them walk ahead, slipping back into the house under the guise of grabbing a forgotten sweater. Once inside, I quickly turned on the dictaphone app on my phone and tucked it under a cushion on the sofa. My heart pounded as I rejoined them, the device now safely recording whatever would transpire in my absence. We walked for a bit, the conversation light, but my mind was elsewhere. After making sure they were well engaged in idle chatter, I excused myself, claiming a sudden headache and the need for a quick lie down. They continued their walk, and I rushed back, my steps as silent as a whisper. Hiding in the small pantry, I strained my ears. Soon, their voices floated through the door, Tom's laced with excitement, his mother's dripping with sinister joy. "It's almost ready, Mom. Once Emma moves in for a few weeks to help out, we can start with the herbs you prepared," Tom said, his voice a cold hiss that sent shivers down my spine. "Oh, Tom, dear, everything's prepared. Those special herbs of mine, they work fast and leave no trace. Just make sure she drinks her tea every morning. No one will suspect a thing," his mother replied, her giggle sending waves of horror through me. "And once she's gone, no more debts hanging over my head. I can finally clean up my mess and move on. Maybe with Jane," Tom continued, unaware of the betraying silence that filled the rest of the house. Feeling like my entire body was encased in ice, I carefully made my way out and back to the empty living room. I retrieved my phone, stopping the recording and slipping it into my pocket, a heavy weight of evidence against them. That night, I lay awake, the recording playing over and over in my head. I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore. I had to act, and fast. The morning couldn't come soon enough, and with it, I'd begin setting my plan into motion. I never thought I'd have to act in my own life as if it were some dramatic scene from a movie. But there I was, coming home from work, feigning despair. I threw my bag on the sofa, letting out a heavy sigh as I collapsed beside it. "I got fired today," I announced, my voice thick with mock desperation. "Jane's dad kicked me out at her request. There's nothing left for me here now." Tom froze, his eyes wide with a mix of shock and, disgustingly, a spark of glee. "You got fired? Really? Well, that's unfortunate, babe. But hey, maybe this is for the best, you know? Now you can move in with my mom, help her out. She needs you." His words, so predictably selfish, fueled my silent fury. "No, Tom. I will never move in with her." "I can't believe you'd even ask that of me," I shot back, standing to face him, my voice rising in controlled anger. His face contorted with frustration as he yelled back, "If you won't do that for me, for us, then maybe we shouldn't be together. Maybe we should just get a divorce." The word divorce hung in the air like a promise. I reached into my bag, my hand clasping the divorce papers I had prepared. Smiling thinly, I handed them to him. "You want a divorce, Tom? You got it. I've signed the papers. It's over." His expression, a mix of confusion and horror, was almost satisfying. "What? You knew? You want this?" "I know everything, Tom," I said, my voice steady, despite the racing of my heart. "About your debts, your plans with your mom, everything." As realization dawned on him, his shock turned to anger, and he stepped towards me menacingly. But before he could reach me, the front door burst open. 2 police officers entered, their presence a wall between me and Tom. Tom paled, his anger deflating as he realized the extent of his exposure. "We have enough evidence to hold you and your mother," one officer announced as they cuffed him. "You're both under arrest on suspicion of conspiracy to commit murder." The trial was swift. The recordings I had made were damning. In court, faced with the undeniable evidence, Tom and his mother confessed to their horrific plans. They were sentenced to several years in prison. Amidst it all, Jane was there, her presence a silent support I hadn't realized I'd missed so deeply. We walked out together, the weight of the past few months lifting slightly with each step. "Let's never let anyone come between us again," she said, squeezing my hand. "Never," I agreed, feeling the truth of our reconciliation. It felt like coming home.